name is Dr. Seth Hamman, like Jennifer said. I teach at Cedarville University in Ohio. I'm a doctor, but I'm not the kind of doctor that you go see when you're sick. But like a medical doctor, I spent a lot of time in school. And I love school so much, in fact, that I'm still in school. Now I'm on the other side. I teach. And what I'm going to teach you guys today is what I've been teaching here in my college classes. So I'm going to give you a preview of what we teach here at Cedarville. And it's my favorite lecture. So I'll make it quick. It won't be as long as my college lectures, but it's going to be on the same content. And it's going to be the skill of adversarial thinking. I hope that you will enjoy it. Cybersecurity is important. I think you guys realize this. The main reason is because increasingly we live in two worlds. So we live in physical space and we live in cyberspace. And those two worlds are actually starting to blend a bit with virtual reality and augmented reality. And we've been going in that direction for a long time, and there's no end in sight. So just like our rights, our privacy, our things, wanting to protect ourselves, how those things are so important in physical space, well, they're also really important in cyberspace. And the more of our lives that we live out in cyberspace, the more we need cyberspace security. But cyberspace security is kind of a mouthful, so we just call it cybersecurity. So it's a very important discipline. It's a very important thing for us to be involved in. And actually, we all have a part to play, whether or not you choose to do something in the cybersecurity ecosystem for a career, or you just are a normal person and you have a computer and you have a smartphone and these types of things, and you have a role to play in keeping yourself safe and others safe as well. So at your school, where you work, all these places, we play a part in keeping ourselves and our neighbors secure. So cybersecurity is really important. Cybersecurity is also inclusive. There's a lot going on in cybersecurity. What this little graph shows, this little chart shows, is that the word cybersecurity is very broad. It actually has a lot of different parts to it. And so there are some technical rules in cybersecurity, and that's my specialty. In fact, our program here at Cedarville, we call it cyber operations. And you can see it down here in the left-hand corner. It's like a really highly technical aspect of cybersecurity. These are what the people like the NSA do and US Cyber Command when they're trying to figure out what's going on in other nation states. You're getting down into the really understanding how computers work, how to find vulnerabilities. So and these are what we typically think about when we think of hackers. So that's part of what cybersecurity is for sure. But that's like a really technical role. If you're somewhere in the middle here, you might be more into business and making sure that your organization stays safe, making sure that the computers are patched, that you have good policies, that your firewall is working like it should. So there you're kind of straddling the technical and non-technical worlds of cybersecurity. So that's kind of where you'd be in the business area. And then on the other side of the spectrum, still hugely important cybersecurity roles. This is where you're involved in policy, decision-making, maybe the legal and ethical aspects of cybersecurity, all important. So probably everybody on this call has an interest somewhere on this spectrum. Maybe you like writing, maybe you like graphics or art, maybe you're not really into computers so much. There's still a role in cybersecurity for you because cybersecurity is not only important, but it's also inclusive. There's something out in the cyber ecosystem for everybody. And lastly, and this is really what I'm going to focus on today, cybersecurity is interesting. It's a fascinating discipline. In fact, it is coming alive today as a new discipline. 20, 30 years ago, there weren't any cybersecurity classes or just very, very few. Now you hear about cybersecurity all the time because it's starting to come up. It's kind of coming of age. Maybe it's somewhere in like elementary school now, and it's starting to mature and bloom. And so it's a neat time to be involved in it as a teacher and as a student. There's tons of opportunities. But what makes cybersecurity so interesting actually is that it's an adversarial conflict, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So first, we have to define cybersecurity. What exactly is cybersecurity all about? Well, this is a definition, and I'm not even going to take the time to read it, It's actually, cybersecurity is kind of hard to define. It involves computers and how do you define that and the network. But let's not worry about that definition. Let's just get down to the simplest possible definition of cybersecurity. I like to say that cybersecurity is computers plus bad guys. That's it. That's what you need to have cybersecurity. Computers, a digital infrastructure, what we call cyberspace, and then adversaries, people who are trying to gain unauthorized access to that cyberspace or those cyber assets. If you take away the computer, well, then we still have a world with bad guys in it, but we don't have cybersecurity. If you take away the bad guys, well, we have a world then with computers in them, and there's a lot of important roles that computers would play, but we don't have cybersecurity. Cybersecurity only exists when you have computers plus bad guys. So that's not a full definition of cybersecurity, but it gives you an idea of what its essence is. What are the two things that are necessary in order for cybersecurity to exist? And that's what makes cybersecurity interesting, because there's this human component in it. There's an attack and defend aspect of it that is inherent in cybersecurity. It's only necessary because of the existence of people who deliberately attack computer systems and networks. We call these people hackers. Now, they're not all bad guys. Some of them are very good guys. Like I mentioned earlier, the NSA and US Cyber Command and our intelligence community and our military community, they also hack into computers, but they do it for good purposes, to protect people. So it's not necessarily bad guys, but it's people that are trying to gain unauthorized access to computer systems. We have a world that doesn't have hackers in it. We have difficulties, and there's things like hardware failures. Maybe your phone stops working or it breaks, or your computer locks up, or you accidentally spill something on your computer, or you delete data that you wish you hadn't deleted. Those things all happen in a world without bad guys or without attackers. But it gets much worse when you start adding in human adversaries. Now, they intentionally break into your computer and they steal your data, or they encrypt your data. That's called ransomware. They actually take your data captive and they write you a digital ransom note saying that you owe them, a Bitcoin or something like that if you want to get your data back. So it's a very complex world. It's a difficult world. Without bad guys, you might have a slow computer or a buggy computer. Sometimes maybe it's a little outdated. But with hackers in the world, and which is the world that we actually live in, you might have bad guys in your computer looking, spying on what you're doing, stealing your data, doing all these kind of things in the background without you even knowing that they're there. So there's a lot that hackers add in to the world of cyberspace, and that's what makes cybersecurity so interesting, because it's an adversarial conflict. And if you think of cybersecurity as a coin, well, the thing about coins is that they have two sides. So this would be a representation of what the cybersecurity coin would look like. It all comes down to authorization. And you can remember these two acronyms, these two three-letter acronyms, CIA and DAD, or DAD. Now, these aren't like a CIA DAD, and this isn't the CIA that you normally would think of, or the DAD that you would normally think of. But this is a way to help remember kind of the two sides of the cybersecurity coin. And it all boils down to authorization. The defenders are trying to keep data confidential. That's what the C stands for on the left side. They're trying to make sure that only authorized people can see data. Meanwhile, on the attacker side, the attackers are trying to gain unauthorized access to that data. So they're trying to disclose it. That's where the D stands for. They're trying to see what they're not supposed to be able to see. And when I say data, that encapsulates anything in cyberspace that's all comprised of data. So that could be pictures, could be videos, it could be emails, it could be documents, it could be a bank account balance, anything in cyberspace. The good guys are trying to keep it confidential, or the defenders are trying to keep it confidential, and the attackers are trying to disclose it to gain unauthorized access. The I stands for integrity. Again, we want to make sure that data is the right data, it's true, and that it's an accurate reflection of what's really happening in the real world. That is the integrity of the data, the wholeness, the completeness, that it's valid, it's legitimate. So your bank account balance really is what your bank account balance is. If you write a check or you send money via Venmo to a friend and you send them $25, you actually sent $25. You didn't send $250. That's an integrity issue. Meanwhile, the attackers oftentimes are trying to, in an unauthorized way, that is without permission, they're trying to change data. And we have there the letter A for alter. They're trying to alter data. So they might try to make that Venmo transaction instead of $25, $250. That's an integrity problem on the defense side, and the attackers are trying to alter it on the attack side. So again, same coin, two sides. And the A for the defenders is availability. We're trying to make sure that the authorized users can access the data in the computer systems that they're authorized, that is, that they have permission to access. So that's what A stands for, availability. Meanwhile, the attackers oftentimes try to deny access to those authorized individuals. They might try to take a website offline or make a computer break or not work anymore. Or like earlier I mentioned ransomware. They're trying to deny you access to your data. So when you think of cybersecurity, think of CIA dad, but it's not the kind of CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and hopefully it's nothing like your dad. It's kind of the bad kind of dad where it's disclosure, alter, and deny, the two sides of the cyber coin. So there's an ancient Jewish proverb that says, do you see a person skilled in his work? He will stand in the presence of kings. So what do we mean when we talk about being skilled in cybersecurity? If I was going to try to kind of live out this proverb and teach you cybersecurity and make you skilled, I would focus on what I'm going to talk about today. And we've only got a few minutes, so I can't do too much. But I'm going to talk today about the skill of adversarial thinking. All right. And this is really what makes cybersecurity cybersecurity. You might be into math. If you're into math, that means that you are very logical in your thinking, because you need to be able to solve math problems in a logical way. You need to be able to construct proofs of why something's true. Like, how do you know whether a number is odd or even? And you can do proofs by contradiction and by induction and direct proofs. That's kind of what makes mathematics, is it's logical thinking. With computer science, oftentimes we're writing programs. We're designing algorithms. So the hallmark, the thing that makes computer science kind of interesting and unique, is what we call algorithmic thinking. But for cybersecurity, the thing that it makes it interesting and unique is adversarial thinking. So adversarial thinking is the ability to think like a hacker. But we need to get a little bit down closer to understand what exactly that means. What does it mean to think like a hacker? Well, thinking has three components. There's an analytical component to thinking. That's kind of like when you're solving math problems. There's a creative component to thinking. This is like if you're an artist or a musician. I have J.K. Rowling here. She's very creative, right? She invented Harry Potter and the world in which Harry Potter lives. That's a creative person. So that's part of what intelligence is, or thinking is. It's creativity, the ability to make connections. And then there's a practical component to thinking. And I have Bill Belichick here. Some of you might be NFL football fans. He's a legendary football coach for the New England Patriots. And he's a brilliant football coach, and he's won quite a few Super Bowls. And he's great at strategy, at overcoming obstacles, is trying to think about what his opponent's going to do on the football field and then coming up with a better game plan. That's called the practical component of thinking. So this is one model to kind of define what it means to think. It's not so easy to define what it means to think, and there's other ways to do it, but this is one model. When we think, we're either doing something analytical, like kind of solving math problems, we're doing something creative, like making a connection, or we're doing something practical, like strategizing or planning and trying to think about what obstacles we might encounter and then how might we overcome those obstacles or prepare for them when they arrive. So if you think about those three components of thinking, then you can actually define adversarial thinking a little bit more precisely, which is something that we really need to do if we're going to try to teach it in the classroom. And by the way, you'll see adversarial thinking come up all the time in cybersecurity. In your classes, people talk about it all the time, but most people don't really know how to define it, or at least to define it very well. So this is how I define it. Adversarial thinking is the ability to embody the technological capabilities, the unconventional perspectives, and the strategic reasoning of hackers, or of those who are trying to gain unauthorized access to computer systems. If you're going to become like a cybersecurity guru or an expert or a ninja in cybersecurity, then you need to be able to do all three of these things. You need to be able to do the analytical part, which is to learn the technology of cyberspace. You need to be able to do the creative part, which is how hackers find creative ways in. They think of something that no one's thought about before, or a security area that was left unsecure because no one thought that the bad guys would break in that way. And hackers are constantly finding those kind of unique creative angles. But then you also need to be able to anticipate attacks. You need to be able to thwart attacks. You need to figure out when an attack is actually happening. And that is the strategic component of adversarial thinking. And so any cybersecurity education must equip you for the technological battle of might, the creative battle of skill, and the strategic battle of wits. I think we do a really good job. And if you have the privilege of being able to take some cybersecurity classes, you're probably focusing mostly on the first one there, the technological battle of might, especially if you're on that end of the spectrum that I looked at earlier, that left side, and cyber operations and cyber forensics and all those things, cyber engineering. You really need to have the technical skills. You need to understand how computers work and how to program and do all those things. So that's important. But what we probably don't do as well is the last one there, which is how do you get better at doing the strategic part? And that's really what I want to focus on today. So adversarial thinking is kind of all three of these things, but I really want to focus today, just a few minutes that we have left, on the last one, on how do you engage in the strategic battle of wits that plays out in cybersecurity as you're trying to anticipate what your adversary is doing and then be able to prevent them from doing what they want to do. Kind of the Bill Belichick mindset, or what you might think of as a commander in battle. There's a way to teach strategic reasoning. Now, the discipline in academia, which is where I work in college or in higher education, there's a discipline called game theory. And so I'm going to teach you the very, very basics of game theory today. And it is the study of strategic reasoning. It's not video games. That's not what I mean when I say game theory. I mean more like chess. I mean like a battle of wits that's playing out between you and an adversary, two human beings or more that are engaged in a strategic contest of some kind. In fact, this is a pretty good picture of a strategic game theoretical game that hopefully many of you recognize. It's called rock, paper, scissors. When you play that with a sibling or with a friend, and you guys know the rules of the game. You do 1, 2, 3. You both choose either rock, paper, or scissors. Paper smothers rock. Scissors cuts paper. And rock pounds scissors. So each one beats one of the other ones. And you have to make a choice. What are you going to choose? When you do that, you're actually doing game theory, whether you know it or not, because you're trying to anticipate what your adversary, which in this case might be your brother or sister, is going to do. And then you're trying to, if you think they're going to do rock, then you're going to do paper, right? Because that's how you beat rock. So that is actually a kind of a very simple game theoretical game that captures the strategic part of game theory. Here's a more classic game theory game. Actually, this game theory game was invented in the 1920s. Even before game theory was an actual real discipline, people came up with this idea, what is now known as the Colonel Blotto game. There's a lot of different game theory games, but this is one of the most famous ones. And I want to tell you the story of the Colonel Blotto game. You have two colonels that manage a certain number of troops. In this case, we're calling the colonels Colonel Blotto and Colonel Alto, or Colonel A and Colonel B. They each have 9 soldiers. Colonel Altos happen to be green and Colonel Blottos are brown. And they're trying to figure out, they're going to have a battle, and they're trying to figure out how many soldiers should they allocate to these different battlefields. So we have battlefield X, battlefield Y, and battlefield Z. And so in the cover of darkness, kind of before the next day, these battles are going to happen. Each colonel needs to assign a certain number of soldiers to a battlefield. And they have to kind of do this without knowing what the other colonel's doing, because they're doing it in the cover of darkness at night. And then dawn, when the sun comes up, the soldiers will fight. And the way the game is played is whoever has the most soldiers on a battlefield wins that battlefield. Okay, so if one of them has 5 soldiers and the other one has 4, the one that has 5 wins. One of them has 5, the other one has 1, same result. The one that has 5 wins. You just have to have at least one more than the other guy. So let's say that Colonel Alto and Colonel Blotto play. Colonel Alto says, oh, that's easy. There's 9 soldiers. There's 3 battlefields. I'm just going to divide my soldiers up evenly. I'll do 3, 3, and 3 across X, Y, and Z. But Colonel Blotto's thinking a little bit more strategically. And he says, what if I do a 4-1-4 split? Well, if he were to do that, he would actually win the war. He does lose battlefield Y, so he loses 1 battlefield, but he wins 2. And therefore, he wins the war, even though he lost one of the battles. So this is how the Colonel Blotto game is played. What I would like all of you to do on this call right now is to play in a real Colonel Blotto game with me. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. I have a website. You can see the URL there. It should be easy for you to type into any web browser. You can even do this on your phone. Type in CyberOps, that's short for Cyber Operations, .cedarville.edu. When you do that, you'll go to a website that looks like this. So while you're doing that, I'm going to ask you to play in this Colonel Blotto game with me. And all of you can play. You can have, if you want to have more than one submission, you can, but I'd like for all of you to have one submission. So hopefully by now you've made it out to the website, cyberops.cedarville.edu. I don't have time to tell you the full kind of picture of the DDoS attack scenario, but just imagine, like we looked at that previous picture, instead of just 3 battlefields, X, Y, and Z, imagine 6. So this is a little bigger game. You're trying to win the war, and you're competing over 6 battlefields. They're labeled A, B, C, D, E, and F. Now, all the battlefields have the same outcome or the same value. There's not one is more valuable than the other. So if you win at least 4 of the battlefields, for example, then you would win the war because you would win 4 points and maybe your opponent would only win 2 points. So you're trying to win as many battlefields as you can. Now, in the slide that I showed you, Colonel Blotto only had 9 soldiers. Well, here you have 120. All right. So you have 120 soldiers that you're trying to assign across these 6 battlefields. And you need to divvy up your troops. You can't have a half of a troop, a soldier, or a 0.1 soldier. So in these 6 boxes, I'd like for you to put in 6 numbers. You can put in any number between 0, including 0, and 120. But when you add all the boxes up, the sum has to be 120 exactly. So that means if you were to assign, 120 soldiers to this battlefield, you can do that, but then you would have to do 0, 0, 0, 0 for the other ones because you have no soldiers left over. Or you could assign 3 soldiers to the first battlefield or 50 soldiers to the first battlefield, and then you can separate your soldiers out across the battlefields. Your goal is to try to win as many of the battlefields as you can. You're going to be playing against everybody else on this call, and I'm going to play too. And so you're trying to win as many battlefields as you can, and you're divvying up your 120 soldiers. So I'm going to start a timer here. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to come up with your strategy of how you would divvy up these soldiers. Okay, and while we're doing that, and hopefully, and some of you may have already completed the task, I will compile the results when we're all finished. It'll only take a second. I want to just talk a little bit more practically about this idea of adversarial thinking. One of the things that the National Cryptologic Foundation put together is this booklet called Outsmart Cyber Threats. And I looked through this, and it talks about adversarial thinking in here. It also talks about why cybersecurity is important and why cybersecurity is inclusive. And it goes through, it tells a story about a girl whose her phone gets a virus on it. And it's a really neat story, but it's really heightening this idea. It's highlighting this idea of why cybersecurity is important and what cybersecurity is all about. I want to dig a little deeper into the adversarial thinking part. What makes it interesting in cyberspace is if the bad guys are going to attack you, how are they going to do it? In other words, if you're a bad guy, how would you attack? And that's called adversarial thinking. So all of us in cyberspace, we need to think about what makes us vulnerable to attack, or what might the bad guys try to do to attack us. And there's a few things that we know they do. For one, when you download software on the internet, that's an opportunity for a bad guy to trick you, to give you software that's actually a Trojan horse, or what we might call a remote access Trojan. So you may be looking for that latest video game that's really cool that you want to play, and you download it from the internet, and you might get a warning that, hey, we're not sure where this video game has come from or whether it's trustworthy or not. Well, if you click accept, or you click, I don't care, I want to play it anyway, you need to be careful, because the adversary knows that you want to play the video game, and they may actually give you the video game. And you may even be able to play the video game. But you probably got something a little extra too that you didn't know that you got. And that is the remote access part. You may have just opened the door for a bad guy to walk through. And bad guys are really good at thinking about, especially if you're at websites that you shouldn't be at, and you're downloading things that you're not supposed to be downloading. Because then they know you're much less likely to raise your hand and say, oh, I accidentally downloaded this game and I think I have a virus. If you think you've done something wrong, you're less likely to confess it or to admit it or to get help. And again, the adversary knows this, and they're more than happy to take advantage of that. So when you're out in cyberspace, that's just one dynamic you need to think about. If I were going to try to attack somebody, maybe I'd make this really cool sounding game, or I'd send a cool sounding attachment, and I'd make the person want to open it. And then really I'm giving them something more than they bargained for. So that's just one kind of aspect of anticipating your adversary. So our time's up here. I am going to now bring in my strategy for the game. I'm going to play as well. I'm going to put in a quick strategy that I've come up with ahead of time. I'm going to allocate my 120 soldiers this way. Now notice these numbers do add up to 120. I'm going to submit my answer like all of you did. And now I am going to show the results of the game. So here are the winners of the game. Why isn't this a couple things to note. First of all, thank you all for playing. There was 18 of you that played. And here you can see the different strategies that were played today. This is called the equal allocation strategy. That's a pretty clever strategy, right? You have 120 soldiers. There's 6 battlefields. You do 20 per battlefield. But notice it didn't do very well, because others may have anticipated that that might be what you do, right? And then we have a variety of different strategies that were in play here. This person concentrated on 4 battlefields, thinking, all right, the most I just need to win 4. And they did a good job. They got 5th place in the contest. And this person did the same strategy, but they just different which battlefields they allocated over. And this was the strategy I played. This happens to be a really good strategy because it anticipates people playing 30 soldiers, and even which battlefields they're most likely to pay their 30 soldiers on, which usually ends up being the first 3 or 4 battlefields. It also thinks that some people might try to leave some battlefields empty, and others might anticipate that and put 1 soldier on those battlefields. But if they're going to put 1, I'll put 2, so I'll beat all the ones that put 0 and 1. So this is an example of a theoretical game, Colonel Blotto, and applying this idea of adversarial thinking. Now we're really short on time now. I'm going to go back to my slides. And I want to just touch on this idea of what does game theory have to do with cybersecurity? Well, it's this ability to anticipate what your adversary is doing. And that's what makes cybersecurity interesting. And the way that we learn how to anticipate is game theory. And hopefully I just demonstrated that with the Colonel Blotto game. I played a really good strategic allocation of soldiers. And fortunately, today it happened to win the contest because I anticipated pretty well what you guys were going to do, because I employed something called level K reasoning, or I anticipated what you were doing, and then I one-upped. I tried to one-up what you did. So like in the game of rock, paper, scissors, rock might be the most obvious strategy. So if I'm playing you in rock, paper, scissors, well, rock is kind of it's the easiest one to play. It's the first one in the name of the game. So I might play paper against you thinking you're going to play rock. I've just thought about what you're going to do, and then I've countered it. And then I might think, okay, you might think I'm going to think that you're going to do that. And so then I might play scissors. And so that's kind of how strategic reasoning unfolds. All right. With that, I'd like to take questions. I know we've only got a couple minutes left. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to answer them.
In the news today, obviously, it's all about the challenge over with Russia, etc. What is one of the ways that they could, as an adversary, affect us from a cybersecurity environment?
Well, Russia as an adversary, they've been very good in cyberspace in terms of making strategic gains against us. And one of the strategic scenarios, the strategies they've employed is they oftentimes do things that against the United States that aren't really raising to the level of an act of war. So we don't retaliate. We don't go over there with soldiers. And they kind of get away with some things, but over time, those things mount up. So that's one of the strategies they've employed against the United States. Now, what's going on in Ukraine is a little different. The things that they're going to be doing there, maybe doing today, I haven't seen the news today. They're going to have a physical space component and a cyberspace component. And they might, for example, attack the power grid at the same time that they send in an invasion of troops. And so that's another kind of strategic angle that they are employing. That's a really good question. And it's really interesting to think about how cyberspace and cybersecurity plays out on a national scale. That's on that spectrum that we looked at earlier. That's on the political science side of things. So that's a great place for us to be involved. And hopefully some of you will pursue careers like that.
What are some of the things that I can do today to prepare me for a career in cyber?
Well, you need to think about where you might want to go on that spectrum. If you're really wanting to go on the technical side, which is kind of what we teach and what I teach here at Cedarville, you should probably learn about computers. If you can take a computer class, if you can take a programming class, if you can learn about operating systems, if you can find tutorials online. Cyberspace is what is the terrain of cybersecurity. And so in order to secure cyber terrain, you need to understand computers and operating systems. So the more you can understand, the better. So I would recommend learning about maybe the Linux operating system, the Windows operating system, Mac OS, programming languages, and those types of things.
Well, what if somebody wants to get into like the social side of cybersecurity? What would you study? Because that's the opposite end, right?
Yes, that is the opposite end. And there's lots of rules there too. So we talked earlier, like, for example, someone wrote this booklet. This is a cybersecurity job. And so they've studied writing and art and graphic design. And they've also thought about how we communicate cybersecurity. How can I teach you cybersecurity? How can I teach you basic principles? So there, just the idea is more of you're studying your discipline, whether it be computer science or maybe writing or graphic art, but you're thinking about how does this apply to cybersecurity? How can it apply to making cyberspace safer? There's room. One of the types of famous cybersecurity attacks is called social engineering. And that has to do a lot with human psychology. So you can study human psychology for lots of different reasons, or you could study it to try to think about, all right, how does the adversary think? How do they operate? How might they try to trick people? And so that's non-technical, might not involve any computer programming, but it involves this idea of there's an adversary and how can I anticipate what the adversary might do?
Awesome. Well, I don't want to go too far over time, but if you guys do have any questions, you can always go to our website at the Cryptologic Foundation and email us, and we can always get back in touch with you. We want to thank you all for joining us today. And a special thank you to Dr. Seth Hamman for being here. It was so wonderful. We loved our interactive activity. Thank you all for participating in that. It was super fun.
Thank you, guys. And my curriculum is available on Clark. You can see the URL here, clark.center. And there's lots of cyber curriculum. So if you're interested in cyber lessons that are free, go to clark.center. And you can search for anything that you want. If you search for adversarial thinking, you'll see what I just taught you today, but a little more. Multiple slide sets, and you can find what you're looking for, whether it's network security or social engineering or whatever. It's out there on clark.center.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. Again, go check that out, especially teachers out there. Go check out Clark Center.
It's all
right.
free.
Yes. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Seth. Great job.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, Jen. Great job.
Thanks, Mark.